So just want to extend a warm welcome to everyone here tonight and also joining us online. We're streaming live on Zoom for a special occasion where we're going to welcome the amazing artist Ibrahim Mahama, who I'll introduce in a few minutes. So my name is Paul Goodwin. I'm the director of TrAIN, Research Centre at UAL, which is the Research Centre for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation, where we're 20 years old. So we've been around for a while. I haven't been here that long, but almost as long. And we're a community of researchers at UAL, which basically in our work attempts to kind of challenge top-down understandings of what happens globally with art and design, and to kind of ground it in local realities and the plurality of practices that are happening around the globe that don't necessarily get that are not part of the kind of central narratives that dominate around the global. We're made up of... Yeah.
Apparently they're having some issues with the sound.
Okay. Okay. So I hope we can... We always technical gremlins that we have. So we don't have a... This mic that I'm wearing is actually just for online.
It's on now.
So it's on. We're okay. So okay. We're all good. All right. Great. So TrAIN is made up of curators, art historians, and design historians, and artists as well, practitioners, and theorists across many disciplines at UAL. And we're a thriving community of research. We also have a thriving community of research students and associate researchers that work with us. So you want to find out more about what we do, about what TrAIN does. We have a public lecture program and other events where we welcome the public to come in, such as this event. You can look us up at our website, which is on the main University of the Arts London website under Research Centres, so search for TrAIN. So I was saying that tonight's event is special because we have a very special guest with us tonight, Mr. Ibrahim Mahama, who's just come to us from Paris, and before that, from Bern, where he's been working on projects with institutions in Paris, which will not be named, and also at the Kunsthalle of Bern, where he just opened an exhibition, which he may or may not talk about this evening. So Ibrahim is with us for a short residency at TrAIN in Chelsea this week, where in addition to his lecture tonight, he'll be giving a masterclass to students across the fine art programme here at Chelsea tomorrow, which we're very excited about. This residency has been supported by the UAL Global Seed Fund Award, for which we're very grateful, the purpose of which is to engage the university with the wider world. And in this case, it's engaging with one of the most dynamic contemporary artists in the world, Ibrahim Mahama, and also with Ghana in West Africa, where Ibrahim was born and raised and is indeed still based. He works from Ghana. We'll be discussing his work in Ghana and its global residencies tonight. He's currently ranked 14th in the Art Review Global 100 Power list. He was 6th in 2022, so you're slipping a little bit there, Ibrahim. And that gives you some indication of his esteem globally, right? And his reach in the international art world. I mean, he's literally everywhere. So we're very pleased to have him join us tonight and over the next few days. I'd like to quickly thank Tim Lunardoni and Melanie Robinson and Gabriele and the team who helped to organise this event tonight. So after I introduce Ibrahim in a second, what we're going to do is Ibrahim will speak for about 30 minutes about his practice and some of the things that he's doing. I'll follow up with a few questions, and then we'll open up to the audience as the usual format. And we'll finish roughly around 7:30, 7:40. So we'll hopefully have plenty of time to a debate in the room. And also online, if you want to ask questions, please put your questions in the chat and Melanie will feed them through to us, to Ibrahim, a bit later on. So a little bit about Ibrahim Mahama. So Ibrahim was born in Tamale in Ghana in 1987. He studied for a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Painting in 2010. And a MFA, Master of Fine Arts in Painting and Sculpture in 2013 from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, Ghana. And he lives and works in Accra, Kumasi, and Tamale. Ibrahim is probably best known for his large-scale installations crafted from jute sacks, symbolizing global exchange and the kind of disparities between goods and people. Through these collaborations, he transforms these sacks into massive patchwork quilts, draping them over renowned structures worldwide. Notable installations include, I'm sure you've seen many of these, public structures in Athens for Documenta 14 in 2017, and also transforming many others, but also transforming the outdoor corridor in the Arsenale complex at the 56th Venice Biennale in 2015. And in fact, it was just after that, not long after that, when we first met Ibrahim, and when we had our first, this is Ibrahim's second TrAIN lecture. He did one in 2016 when he was working with White Cube. He still is actually working with White Cube Gallery. And this is the first, that was the first of, in 2016, first of several public conversations here at Chelsea in the banqueting hall. And also we've had conversations in Venice. I think we had 2 in Venice. And I can't remember where the other one was. But anyway, we've had a few conversations. And this is so we're really glad to bring Ibrahim back to kind of embed those conversations and really see what we can create. In addition to his artwork he's producing, Mahama has founded the Savannah Centre for Contemporary Art, the SCCA, in 2019, which fosters research and artist residencies in Tamale. I'm sure we're going to hear about that tonight. In 2020, opened Red Clay Studios, a studio complex followed by an educational institution, the Nkrumah Volini, in 2021. Ibrahim has a profound commitment to storytelling, economic exchange, and challenging colonial legacies. And I think his work invites viewers to explore the complexity of crisis, the questions of failure, which we'll talk about, I know, and global transactions, using unconventional materials and architectural space. The ambition of the work is quite astonishing. In addition to his use of textiles and old jute sacks, often sourced from markets, Ibrahim is, I'm going to quote you here if you don't mind, I'm interested in how, obviously he can quote for himself, but I'm going to quote for him. I'm interested in how crisis and failure are absorbed into this material with a strong reference to global transaction and how capitalist structures work. So marked with names, the sackcloth often bears the traces of its journey and the people that it's encountered, forming a kind of skin for the urban fabric. Textiles are a really important part in Ibrahim's practice, and he sees them almost as an archival document, marked with time and place. Just the last part, and I will let you talk. He's had many solo exhibitions, including at the Kunsthalle Onnersbruck in Germany, the Oudkerk in Amsterdam, the University of Michigan Museum of Art, and the Whitworth University of Manchester in 2019. And he's also participated in numerous group exhibitions, including Sharjah Biennial 15, 2023, the 18th Venice International Venice Architecture Biennial, the Biennale de Sao Paulo, Venice Biennale, as I mentioned, Documenta 14, Athens and Kassel, etc., etc. And he was also artistic director of the 35th Ljubljana Biennale of Graphic Arts in Ljubljana in 2023. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Ibrahim Mahama. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was very brief. Yes, as always. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, honestly, for organizing all of this. And yeah, I've known Paul for the longest period. We've done so many conversations together. You know, I almost lose track of it. Yeah, and I'm very happy to see a lot of friends and family here, like people I've met in many different ways. I was thinking a lot about what to share today when I was thinking about what to prepare for the lecture. Then again, I thought, okay, maybe I would present some of my notes together with mixing it up with some of the things that I've been doing at home, both the institutional work, but also thinking about it in relation to, let's say, the public sculptures and things that I work on. You know, as Paul said, I went to the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. Myself, I think one other person that went there is my good friend and colleague here, Elolo, who is doing a residency at the, what's the, Delphina, yeah, Delphina Foundation, yes. And we had a professor, caricature, and caricature was mainly interested in this idea of art as a gift. So thinking about art not just as a commodity, but as a gift. So if you're making art in art school, it's not so much about the production of the objects, but more or less about the production systems around the object and how that also reflects on the space that this is coming from. So one of the things that I became very much interested in was this idea of the accumulated history of labor. Yeah, the idea that every object has this accumulated labor, which is somehow attached to it. So I start from here, which is there is a movie. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It's called Shutter. It was first shot, I think, in Thailand, and then the Americans did another version of it. But the entire story is about a group of friends who killed this lady, and her ghost. It's a horror movie, and her ghost somehow lashes onto the main protagonist, and then each time he goes to the hospital and he checks his weight, he's like 150 kilos, but he's a very skinny man, and they could never tell. In the end, of course, many people die, and in the end, he ends up in a psychiatric hospital with his back broken. And it was only in the end that he could know through this flash from a camera that the ghost all along was on his back, and that's where the story is. So I like to think about it in relation to like the accumulated history of labor, in relation to like the condition of labor and how that is somehow embedded within forms that we work with. So, so we can again think about the labor of ghosts, the ghost of labor, because most often when we're thinking about architecture and things like that, so we never really think about it within that grand scope. You know, when an architect is designing or building something, we always say, oh, the architect did this, but we never really think about going deeper into like the labor conditions and things like that. And those were things that interested me. That's why in the beginning of my practice, I started working with the jute sacks, because I somehow felt that because the jute sacks had been made in Asia, brought all the way to Africa for transportation of commodities, all these histories were somehow embodied within it. So then now, if you're going to take it to make a tapestry, then the tapestry with all the scars and everything begin to reveal the stories that are embedded within it. Yeah. So here are photographs of red clay of the building process when I decided to build a studio up north, and very interested in this idea of like just building a studio with bricks and thinking about the labor that goes into it. But you know, you have to build something with brick. You have to do it hand by hand. Every single brick is laid individually. So thinking about that and what that means. In the beginning of the building of the studio, I was very, like, this was an image from 2015, just around the time that I was invited to the Venice Biennale. This was with Okui's Biennial in 2015. And that was the time I started building, because just prior to that, I did my first international show here in London at the Saatchi Gallery. And when the Saatchi said they wanted to buy the piece, I said, okay, fine. I had never seen that kind of money in my life before. But when I was paid the money, I said to myself, what do I do with this amount of money? And I said, okay, maybe I will buy land and then build a studio with it. But the idea was to build a studio up north, where I came from. But up north in Tamale, it's like rural village. A lot of people, no one would think about building a studio there, because one, if you're building a studio, then you're also thinking about the markets, because a lot of artists, if you have a studio in Accra, it means when there are curators in town, they can visit your studio. When the people, so-called art connoisseurs, people would come to your studio and pretend to understand the work, and then, yeah, things like that. But I was never interested in those things. I was just interested in what it meant to build a studio there. And also with caricature and the Black Star Lines, in Kumasi, the idea was to think about ways in which we could build studios, and the studio itself could be part of the making of art. because the whole point of art is to produce something that allows us to reassess our humanity and everything. So started the shell, but whilst I was doing that, there were artworks which I was making at the time, like working with these boxes, which are shoemaker boxes, which are used for repair. So thinking about the studio as a space of repair, so we could somehow, we can start talking about this idea of excavating, this idea of repair from the condition of this box into like the architecture. So out of that, we could also excavate like these planes and other things which you'd see later. So I started photographing like these people like repairing the shoes and others in the city. And you can imagine the idea of this is just to repair, because normally in Europe when you wear your shoes and they're torn, most people don't repair them. You buy a new one. But in Africa, I always say that we repair not just the shoe, we repair the soul of the shoe. It's like the spirit inside the shoe itself needs repair, because you can't leave us just now. So started looking at that, but mostly also looking at how we could connect that to, for instance, much bigger historical systems, like the history of the railway, which is also connected to like the colonial system and all that. And this is from a place in Accra called Kantamanto, where all the second-hand goods go to. It's a big market, and they had an old train there which they had sold for scraps. And I bought this train. In order to transport it, we had to work with these men to like rebuild like the line, and so we'll go more into that. So we're looking at this question of repair. So again, I don't know how many of you know the history of the golden stool in Kumasi, with Ashantis. In the early 20th century, the British demanded that the Ashantis give them the golden stool, and they didn't. So the king at the time, Prempeh, he was taken by the British and he was sent to exile in the Seychelles. And of course, they returned him much later. But the most interesting part of the story was there was a queen mother of Ejeso, Yasantua, who declared war on the British at the time, because she said, well, you've taken our king and all the men who are left are cowards, but a woman, like if it's left to us, like as the queen mother, we would. So she led the what was left of the army to, of course, they lost the war, but it's very interesting because the golden stool it's very intrinsic to the history of the Ashanti people, because that marks the big, like the history of the Ashanti, like the king of the Ashanti people, who Otumfuo Osei Tutu was the first. And the golden stool, yeah, so an idea, this is not a golden stool, actually. So this is like a stool, like one of these stools, like Ashanti stools. But also, this furniture that you see here is one of the many furnitures that was made in the British colonial period. There's a project I'm working on in London here at some point, which we're bringing some of these stools to build a parliamentary form, which you'd see more in the next coming months. But the idea was like go, again, excavating these historical forms and then repairing some of these forms and then seeing how we could make interventions with them. So I like this idea of thinking about the question of debt, and also how, like as an artist, you can we are inspired by the conditions that exist within the society. We collect objects that are in the end of almost at the end of their life cycle. Maybe we trade them, whatever. We use them to produce artworks, and then it produces some kind of capital, surplus capital, and then we use that capital to intervene, for instance, in building new types of institutions, or building systems that usually wouldn't exist in a way. So again, some of the works that I'd made earlier on in my practice, so thinking again, because I spoke about the idea of the commodity, but also how we can somehow, the gift is also like the extraction, which also comes out from the system in terms of all the surplus value and things that are created out of this system that we're thinking about. So cocoa, like the cocoa beans, when I buy some of these materials, they have these seeds within them. Yeah, and also thinking about weight, literally. Yeah, so you have the cement bags that we use in Ghana. Each one is 50 kilos. I think it's the international like weight standard. And then you have like different ones, Jata, the Gassem, which was popular for a long time. And then in the construction field, each time they offload the cement and then they mix the concrete, and then they carry the pan on their head. Each time it's like 25 kilos or more. So if you calculate how much weight a laborer has to work in a construction site, by the time it's done, they would have carried almost an equivalent of, let's say, 168 coaches of TrAIN on their body. So thinking about that weight, so that's why I wanted to start with the idea of the shutter, because it's that kind of invisible condition which we don't really think about. And so I try to make these connections, like looking at, for instance, these objects, because we're talking about architecture, and it includes many different things. It could include the trains, the planes, thinking about the material value of these things, and how, for instance, when a train is being used, we're just thinking about its use value, because when you're in the tube in London, you're not thinking about anything. You just want to get to your destination. You only start thinking about it when it breaks down. You're like, oh, what could be the problem, you know? So for me, I like to, because a lot of the work that I do, I start from that point of view. Even when the thing is working, I'm thinking about the problem within it, or the structural form within it. So you could see I make different maps out. So this is an image of some of the locals that were brought by the British in the early 20th century, and then some of the trains that we're saving, and then how some of them are cut into scraps, but how art is able to intervene within these things, because it's not a sensible thing that we're doing. When you're making art, you're not trying to be sensible. Yeah, you're trying to ask questions, and those questions sometimes can be stupid. But they can be stupid, but they can be very important to life or humanity. You can't be too sensible in this world when acting. And so one of the spaces that also I look at a lot now is the locomotive workshop. So this is a very important space. This space was built by the British in the early 20th century. So this is where it was the largest railway repair workshop in sub-Saharan Africa. And when the British made it, it was around the time that they built the railway in the Gold Coast. And the main purpose of this was to repair the trains, or to produce parts when they brought them to the Gold Coast and all that. But today, they are not running as they used to be, and the railway network has collapsed also. So I've been spending a lot of time there since I was a student, looking at just observing work, and also trying to somehow understand what it means to excavate these forms that we are trying to get. So images of, we have these buildings in Ghana called the Food Distribution Corporation. Actually, they're called the former Food Distribution Corporation. In the late 50s, when Ghana gained independence, Nkrumah built a series of industrial complexes around the country. And this one was supposed to be a silo. It was actually, Nkrumah brought in a lot of the guys from the Eastern Bloc. So from the Soviet Union, from Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, they were working on these projects all across Ghana. And this building was meant just to store the share nuts. And in the Savannah region up in Ghana, we have, they just grow wildly. Burkina Faso, Niger. And it was never completed. During the Cold War in the 66, when Nkrumah was overthrown, the building was abandoned. So during COVID, I bought the building so we could turn it into a public space. It was when something is government, it doesn't mean it's public. Yeah, so sometimes it can be government, state-owned, but private, and then it can be private, but then publicly accessible. So sometimes the question is, what does the artist do? Because as an artist, I have no business with excavators and things like that. But then again, we also have to remember that there are artists like Robert Smithson and many others through Land Art, Anna Mendieta and others. They've done, all of this work was already done in the 60s and 70s. So certainly, even in our own trajectory in Ghana, I might be an artist doing this in 2002, but also trying to trace the memory or the spirit that allows us to do this project to, let's say, these practices back then. And so this is an example of one of those buildings. So there were many built across the country, never completed. And then this is in a place in the Volta region called Ho. Yeah, so also going around doing research, looking at these different spaces. And then so to do that, we had to excavate all the rubble and things that were in it to make it accessible. And there was a huge ecosystem of bats, owls, frogs, snakes, all kinds of things in the building, you know. And then, of course, we kept the ecosystem in the building, not the snakes. Those ones, we are open to everything, but sometimes we have to discriminate a bit. And it was very interesting. When you look at this image, it almost, like in Ghana, we have this illegal mining thing, Galamsey, and it almost looks like it could be an image of like something, a disaster or something. But we are actually excavating this building to make it accessible to the public. So again, as artists, it's a question of courage again, because it was in COVID time and there was no money. And I had to sell a few works and raise the money to buy the building, because imagine they were going to scrap the building. And I had to argue to the city, and I said, no, this building is important, blah, blah, blah. I said, but it's never been used before. And I said, that's what makes it important, because of all the potentials which were embodied within it. It's like we don't know, and also we can't, it's not about nostalgia and saying that, oh, let's go back. No. We're trying to excavate that potential that was in the past that we never really realized, but artistically in a very different way. So in traditional Ghanaian society in Winneba, this city where the bricks are coming from, that goes all the way to Tamale, they have this festival called the Abuachiri, and Abuachiri means catching the animal. So they go to the bush, two groups, and then they see who can catch the antelope live. So they go and then they grab the antelope. It's one of the most important festivals. So like there's a question of courage in this festival. So thinking about that in relation to even this idea of harnessing this sense of courage in terms of dealing with certain forms with which normally we wouldn't deal with. So I will take it to SCCA, which is the Savannah Center for Contemporary Art. So I started building this space in 2014, also again from the Saatchi, from the first sale. And the idea was to build a studio space, but then it was converted into like a project space. So we did our first exhibition with an artist called Winston Kofi Dawson, who had studied in the Slade Art School. He was one of the first 3 students at the Kwame Nkrumah University in '62 when the Fine Arts program was created, which I did, Ellen Atri did. So a long list of artists came from. And our second exhibition was with an artist, Ajman Osei. And Ajman Osei is a painter, also like 20th century, early 21st century. But he also studied at Kwame Nkrumah University, but he is also a brick maker. And I was in a residency in Ebury in his house, which is made of bricks. And he and I in caricature, my professor, were talking about building things out of bricks, and that's where this idea of red clay was born. But since he's also a painter, so one of our colleagues, Kwesi Ohiniaye, together with 2 others, Ajuamo and Tracy, did an exhibition of his. So we opened the studio with an exhibition of his. So here you can see that even in the exhibition, we're working like the students, my studio assistant, together with students, and Ato and Hassan Issa were 2 artists that I had to commission to go to Kofi Dawson's studio to help him to bring out his old works, because Kofi Dawson he stopped painting for quite a while. So the idea was also how to like re-excavate that sense of energy from this old master or painter who, we owe so much to if you're a painter like you, and so many people have laid down the path, but due to the lack of infrastructure and all that, but at least through the pedagogy of the university, through like Black Star Lines and caricature, at least we could think of our practice through this way. So the studio, which now becomes an institution, becomes this way in which we excavate that. So you even see Elolo there. So we have like a lot of students, like a lot of our colleagues, working with us to like excavate these potentials. So this was the exhibition of what's his name? Ajman Osei. This was the second exhibition that we did, and it was a really fantastic show. And for this exhibition, the curators wanted to build this soil on the entire floor, so they spent a lot of time actually filling up the whole floor with the soil, because the original floor that we made was terrazzo. And we go back to the early work. So some of these works I was doing when I was doing my MFA at the university. So this was like between 2012 and 2014, yes, before I did any international show. So this was a building in Accra, which was being worked on, and I had to like do a lot of negotiation. And this is the university library. at KNUST, which was my final MFA show at the university. So at the time, it was, again, looking at this relationship to the architecture in relation to the material. And this is from, what's the name? The Great Hall. So the previous building that you saw was this one. And this is the old library, which was built during the colonial period. And this is the new library. And this is the Great Hall, where we do all the commemorations and everything, the graduation ceremonies and everything. So I was invited through Black Star Lines, through the Vice Chancellor of the university, to wrap the Great Hall during the graduation ceremony. And a lot of the students were not impressed, because normally when you do this, the building is quite iconic and everyone wants to take a picture next to the building. Like, why are we taking pictures next to these rocks? Of course, much later on, they appreciated it more when they came to learn about it more. Yeah, so it was one of those things. And this is the National Theatre in Ghana. So obviously, when you're doing these kinds of projects, there's a lot of drawings involved. This building was built by the Chinese in Ghana in 1992. So all the plans were in Chinese. So I couldn't do anything. So I had to go. I spent more than a year going back and forth in the building, drawing the entire building again by hand in order to understand the scale of the work that we're going to do. And also, due to technology, you have drones and other things, so I could map out the space. And then I feel like it's my old life. This was 10 years ago. And then so I come back to the architecture again, so the residue. So this is a factory in the western region of Ghana. It's in a place called Abosso. In 1966, during the Cold War, before Nkrumah opened the factory, and it was a glass factory, and this was the largest glass manufacturing factory in sub-Saharan Africa. Nkrumah commissioned the factory, and 19 days exactly afterwards, he was overthrown in a coup when he was in Vietnam, at the time mediating peace. So that could tell you, because Ghana was sending engineers to Singapore, Malaysia, because we got independence around the same period. So that tells you at what point we were, because the idea of the Black Star and everything. And this factory ran for many years, and that was the factory that produced all the bottles that we used in Ghana in more than 50 years. So our whole childhood, and even shutters for buildings, glasses. And at some point, in the last couple of months, in the last year, the government scrapped the entire factory. Yeah. And I always ask myself, if something is no longer working, why can't we just intervene and turn it into something? But no, but they sold it as a scrapyard, just as the building before that I bought. So I said, okay, I went in, I negotiated with the company that had bought it, and then I bought at least half of the factory, what I could. But I tried to get the building, because I'm thinking of it in an archival sense, thinking about all the memories, the ghosts, everything that are within this. So we had to work with engineers to remove the entire building and then pack it and send it to the studio. So thinking about it in relation, there are these elements that you see, which are the bottles. So there's a really interesting old movie. I remember when we were kids growing up, they showed it in every Eid al-Fitr. It's called The Thief of Baghdad. And it's made in I think it was made in the 40s, 44 or something. Yeah, it's about this guy, Abu, who finds this bottle on the sea, and then he opens it, and there's a genie, and then he gets these wishes and everything. So thinking again, because when I bought it, one of the main things, aside the steel, which we had to work with the people within the community and engineers to excavate and everything, one of the things was these bottles. Yeah, so literally hundreds of thousands of bottles which were just left in the factory. And they had all the dust and everything in it. And I said, oh, these are very important. They have so much potential in them. Each bottle almost contains that promise within it, that genie, that idea of excavation. So we had to collect all these bottles. And when I bought it, someone would imagine, why would you buy something that requires more than 50 times the amount to transport it? Because they're very delicate. But then that's why I said, arts, we're not doing it for sense. There's no sense in it, It's there's a question of debt also within it, because we're contemplating on it, chewing on it whilst we're actually executing the action. So we can also look at it in relation to this. This is one of the old Ghana Airways planes. Ghana used to have this airline, Ghana Airways, and we flew everywhere, to London, to Düsseldorf, a lot of Ghanaians who live in the UK, who came here maybe in the 60s and 70s, who never went back and settled here. A lot of them came in Ghana Airways. Yeah, so the ghost of these people are all embedded in it. And at some point in the 2000s, we had 3 aircraft that was left that was working. And the government sold this airline because they only needed $1 million at the time to revive for operations, and the government said no. And once it was sold, it meant that it gave access to land, because they had so much land in the city and the country, and everything was sold, you know. So, so one of these planes, there were two left. One was used as a restaurant in Ghana. When you land at the airport, you can go and eat in it. And then the other one was sitting there, something. So I was very much interested in this idea of having this conversation with the plane. And then they had sold it to another company called Amtrak. They ran for a few years, and they also closed down. So when I bought this plane because of some of the things that we do, like you see the pictures of like using it as classrooms and all that. And the Amtrak was faded on the plane. So the idea was to like work with these street painters and then to relabel the plane Ghana Airways. So now when you're landing in Accra, the plane is just sitting on the runway. You can see Ghana Airways, but it's like an exhibition which you only get to see in like 2 seconds as you're landing, and that's it. But we are going to move it. So this is an image of Nkrumah when he got the news that he had been overthrown in '66. So I think all these things that we're talking about, I think quite reflecting that in the 60s. So these are like just images of like the transportation of some of these objects. So working with like electricians. So this is the same man doing the electrical works in the studio, but because we're transporting a massive object like this through the city, with the tail and then the electrical wires, he has to dismantle the like the light poles and things. I'm sorry, there are things that you can do in Africa that here you cannot do, because here the bureaucracy killed everything before it starts. You know, they're like, no, you cannot do it. And then, but in Africa they would say, no, you cannot do it, but I'll go ahead and do it anyway. Yeah. So there was the most that can happen is that you're put in jail or something. So this, again, looking at like these objects, so like looking at these objects, so these objects are traveling long distances. You can imagine. This is coming from like 650 kilometers away. So even this idea of moving these objects across space, and then looking at how even young people are interacting. So it's like a moving exhibition, because when these trains came here, this was the first time in this part of the world that people who had never been, most people have, the first time they were seeing trains. But when you're here, you take it for granted, honestly. You're like, you take the tube every day. But there are places in the world where you talk about train, and they're like, what are you talking about? So for us, it was quite interesting. But also thinking about that in relation to historical forms. So like at the studio at Red Clay, which we're going to go into, like in relation to like even like this image of like how the kids or people like in schools are accessing this, what the artist produces, you know. Because it's one thing that we don't think about so much, when the artist makes work, is that the end of it? Or can we revisit the question of redistribution, again, within that, because we're already talking about labor. So maybe there are people in the community who are accessing the studio, but they're coming in many different ways. So here, you can see that they're coming like a food truck, and then the truck is broken down. And then even the kids, the 3-year-olds, are helping to push the truck. Here they'll be like, you cannot do this. But it's part of the condition. And those conditions are very important, because sometimes we pretend that the world is something that it's not. So for us, we're very interested in how these things come into being through the experience. And this is a tuk-tuk driver. During COVID period, he came to the studio with some group of people. And he was like, wow, I didn't know that art existed in this form, and there's a studio like this. So, and also, of course, the studio is freely accessible at all times. He went home, closed work that day, and he brought all the kids in his house, all in this small tuk-tuk, normally which is just for, 3 or 4 people. Yeah, so he put all these kids in it. And he's even so kind, he puts a piece of wood to prevent them from falling out, you know. It's like the epitome of like precarity, you know, then. And so we skip to here now. We're looking at even like, again, back to the condition of the studio, where you have someone like Zachariah, who is the caretaker. And like, this is from 2016, when we're still like building the studio from the beginning. So he's always been there helping to build, guide, like checking everything is okay. But then when kids come to the studio, he's one of the people that runs the tours and everything. And he's traditionally he's a farmer, but he also trained at some point in his life as a event photographer and all that. But it's also very interesting in terms of like, what does it mean? This is a work by Olafur Eliassen. So traditionally, you wouldn't think about the work of an Icelandic artist, let's say, in a village in Africa. And that's what we don't think about, because most often, a lot of artists' works, especially from the global south, when we produce our works, those works end up where? In the West, because of the history of what? The shift in where the capital accumulates. Most artists don't really think about it because the work is shown in the Tate and that's it. It's fantastic. But then also, it's very important. The question is that what's the relationship of the work to that space? Because the accumulated labor that we're talking about comes back again to it, even as precarious as it can be. So even if Assemblyman is talking to them, and it's not even within the same artistic language, and even the more important thing, it's even using the local language, because then now he's talking in Dagbani. And as you get to learn other languages aside English, you come to realize that English is not as poetic as it is, as a language can be. So some of these languages can also help to make other meanings out of things. So I'm sorry, Paul. I'm going.
No, you're fine.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So here we can think about like the idea of like genocide of forms, like thinking about like our objects are like disintegrated or like torn apart. So thinking about the train again, I like this painting of Francesco Goya of the May Massacre. So again, like thinking about the work that we do in relation to also other historical conditions and forms. I remember when we had to take some of the trains when I had to buy. Some of these trains were still working, but then they had been sold as scrap. So I had to work with like the engineers and like the people to actually like bring them back to life and then to do the servicing and everything in order for us to be able to transport that. But someone would say that that's not the role of the artist. So in the studio, when we are assembling, because it's open, the kids within the community is just open, everyone comes to see. So again, that was one of the main reasons for building the studio there, because at the end of the day, someone might say, oh, but they don't understand art. But I'm like, who understands art? No one understands art. If anyone tells you they understand art, then they're lying to you. No one understands. The whole point of art is that we're always trying to re-understand the world that we're living in, as complex as it is. So we use the point of ground zero as a starting point and to learn. So even when I bought the railway materials and everything because of the historical conditions, the idea was to rebuild it in the studio. So thinking of it almost as a scar within the landscape, and because they had never existed there. So a lot of these kids, this is the first time they're seeing the railway tracks and everything. But I had to bring the railway workers from the south to build it because they had the knowledge together with the local people. And we invited the school kids almost as a workshop to come and witness. So it's almost as if they're witnessing an archaeological exercise, but this time around, we're not taking something from the earth, we're rather burying something. Because their ancestors were the ones who were taken from here all the way to build a railway in the south. But that system and all the excesses that were born out from it never extended here. So now it's almost as if we're bringing the ghosts back into this space. So even like doing performances, like working with the local community, activating these objects by manual labor, things like that. So there are different ways of thinking about your relationship to, let's say, a form. If you were in a train and a tube and then it broke down and it said, oh, get down, we're going to push the train to the next station, it would seem so bizarre. Yeah, but for where I come from, there are only possibilities. So this is the image I was talking about, excavating the rail lines and then building the train track to rescue the old train, because when I bought it, they would not let me take the train from where it was. And I said, I'm going to take the train. So after after almost 1 year of going back and forth, we even had to use other parts of the state apparatus. For instance, going to see the police and saying making a complaint to the police. The government will not let us take the thing. The police come in there and they say, why are you not letting him take the thing? But the police is still states. They're paid by the states, you know. And in the end, they said, okay, fine, you can. But there was no way to do it. So we had to excavate an old line, build a line, and then get the men who were in this area, like mostly like who were doing drugs and others, to like physically lift the train and put it on this line and then push it like 100 meters away where we could get access to it within the heart of the market. So again, the question of courage, but all these objects are coming from there. Of course, this is the famous picture from New York. So looking at these forms, but all these would not exist if not for us somehow re-exercising this spirit of courage and thinking about the combination of bodies. These are the typical school uniforms in Ghana from the public schools. This is a work by one of our colleagues, Sandra Chira, which is a part of an exhibition that we did a couple of years ago at the SCCA. So looking at the relationship between these forms. Again, if you're talking about the artist's work, yeah, it can be a painting. And in Sandra's work, she works with sand and pigments and other things, but it can also be like historical materials like raw steel and others. So again, these images should not exist because all these things, when I bought them, they had been marked for demolition. So it's almost the memory of it even wouldn't exist. But now we're dealing with like the physicality of the objects in relation to the space, but also dealing with the ghosts that they present. So all of these are like different images of like different production, like building through the architecture. But I remember when I took this image in 2015, I never imagined that the studio would become what it is today in terms of thinking about artistic language and form. And shortly, 2015, 2016, this work was made, shown in Ukraine at the Pinchuk Center, and shown at the White Cube here in London. I think that was the first talk that we had here at the Chelsea. And again, in London, you can just go and see it. But in Tamale, where the roads are bad and everything, to get to the studio, even at my studio, we'd have access to drinking water. So we take a lot for granted here. And then for these kids to get to the studio, their school is like 20 kilometers away. And the school says, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have a bus. Or we have a bus, but we can't put fuel in the bus to take you. And the teacher comes up creatively and says, okay, fine, but we still want to make the trip, and asks the kids, can we all agree that we want to go? They say, yes, they're very enthusiastic. Okay, can you put on your physical education uniforms? We'll get permission from the school. It's a PE exercise. We're going to do a run. And then 40 kilometers later, just to see art. But here, if they told you to run from here to where, Tate Britain, here, be like, oh no, that's so far away. Yeah, but again, so that's the question of the courage. So the courage is not just from the artist, but the courage also is born when we also go out of our way to build things that also creates a new condition for experience. So, and sometimes you see some of these images, like these works, like medical stretchers, objects which are from Europe, used for making work, which again, I'm looking at it in relation to Picasso's Weeping Woman, and also in relation to like the box and how all these different spaces, industrial residues are coming together to build this. And this is one of my studio assistants, Benjamin, taking a group of school kids through like the studio. So like, again, each time I'm making work, the first question is that what's the relevance of the work in relation to the context where it is? It's not so much about, oh, where is the work going to be shown in which museum? No, it's about the context, which is very important. Because, and again here, you can see the local women within the community either carrying kerosene, things that they sell, and then the kids who are also experiencing. Here, it was just one, and then from time to time, we reconstitute the work, and this time around, we build two forms, which the experiences also changes. Yeah. So even when we're installing, it's always open, whether daytime, nights, whatever. We're also like sharing the processes of installing these artworks. And this is a work, Capital Corpses, at the studio, which you can sit on, because these desks, again, they are coming from the British colonial designs. And when I did a show at the White Cube 4 years ago already, when the work was there, the work was an object. So you could walk around it, but you couldn't go into it, you know? Of course, when you're working with the museums and galleries, also, like the work has all these moving parts because some of the machine parts are moving. In Ghana, when the kids come, we're like, hey, yeah, the machine parts are moving, so don't put your hand in there. A lot of them, their parents have machines at home, so they understand that sensibility. But here, no. So there's a different sense of relation to the object. And then here, in one of the other spaces, we have like other artworks which are made of like excavated materials from like either an old rubber factory or like drawings and other things. So again, a question of how to redistribute this through the question of redistribution. And this is another piece that was installed recently. It's a work that was made from these old satellite forms that I collected a couple of years ago. It was made and then shown and then put in storage. And recently we said, why not we install some of these works that can be in the public space outdoor? And again, we're talking about a human, but I was talking about the volley, the bats and everything. But in the studio, we also just have like goats, chickens. So they're like roaming in the. Sometimes we wake up in the morning, like even at the top of these installations, we have like owls and then birds that are like hatching and nesting within the installation and all that. So when we were installing one of the works, there were like owls that were learning to fly, and sometimes they would fall. And then, yeah, this day they were very lucky because these two guys, they were not very enthusiastic about letting them go. And yeah, we had to like let them go because there we have a lot of like owls and bats that are living within these spaces. So again, thinking about the openness of the architecture and how that also helps. We're coming to the very end. So here, we're looking at the last part, which is the Parliament of Ghosts, which is, I was looking at this work by Gustave Courbet, the artist studio. Here, in a small, you can see that there is a little boy who is drawing on the floor. And according to the story around the work, that was Gustave's son. And in the studio, I did this work in Manchester, the Parliament of Ghosts. And the idea was to build this parliamentary form which was made up of these historical residues. But I like this idea that in Tamale, we built it as an architectural form, as a work. But we could be building the space whilst we're using the space at the same time. Whilst there are other kids who are witnessing all of this at the same time. Whilst the artist is photographing and looking at this at the same time. So the idea of like intervening or using architecture or being within it in real time as it's developing is also very important. We don't want it to be something alien, something that, oh, when we came, everything was done. But we like the idea that because most of these kids, when they grow up, the memory of the building is very important to us. So again, the idea of building something as a stage or staging something, what does it really mean in terms of like using the space for workshops and all kinds of other things. Yeah, so you can see how we're using the space in different times. I did a lecture for like 600 high school students, so just with a TV screen like this, and then we sat and we had conversations around like the building of the institution. So these are different also iterations of like the parliamentary form, so looking at it again in relation to the question of the ecosystem, the question of the repair, and also in relation to like straw, like materials which are used in the local architecture and all that, how we excavate all these forms. And this is like pieces of stick that are collected from the local environment at the end of the year when the dry season is about to start for building and everything. So also again, and these are the protagonists, so these are the women from the community that we work with within the studio. So normally the people who are like, you don't see, so they help in the studio in building things, the installations, the keeping up the studio clean for like the general public to come there all the time to see it, and so many other things that we do. And it's very important to us. And then also again, looking at the relationship between traditionally someone selling fruits or whatever. In an older image, a painting of this woman would be made and it would hang in a gallery or a museum or on a wall. But then maybe there could never be any relationship between the woman and the... But in this case, the artwork becomes part of the condition. So we're dealing with the world as it is. So you can't say, oh yeah, you don't put... No. There are people going around the studio and one person is hungry, they want to eat mango. Just because there's art doesn't mean we shouldn't eat. No, we peel the mango around the work. So for me, that is very important to think about. And this is the last, very last. I decided to show this as the very last, which is this series of images from also going back to the idea of like using, excavating, re-excavating the spirit of all this to make like bigger gestures. Like when I was commissioned to do the Barbican, yeah, a couple of years ago. Yeah, the purple hibiscus. And after I had chosen Chimamanda's book, the title, to start the work from that point of view, working with the material, working with the weavers, we designed the material, giving it to the weavers, because then we weave these materials, but normally it's just a gown that they wear. And I've been collecting these gowns as long as I've been collecting the sacks, but never really used them. And I thought, okay, this is the time to like really work on a large scale, because the Barbican was very interested in the ambition of the work. And again, the studio, I have all these studio spaces, but I never make any work in this studio space. So again, going back to renting, so I go to the railway space, the market space, and in this time we said, oh, why not we rent the stadium in the city to use as a studio space? And also we needed a lot of people to work with. So I hired over 1,000 people, weavers. So when they were not playing games, we were sewing in the pitch. So I also like this idea that through the drone, we could get the relationship between the bodies and the material in relation to the floor. So gradually working our way through the weaving process and then dividing it, because almost as if we're making it we're tailoring it to the Barbican, because there's a company here called Millimeter. And like literally millimeter. I remember when we did it, we're like, oh, we leave a few. And when it came here, they're like, no, we have to remove that part, because everything had to fit because of the precision to the building and then the wind within that area. So in the end, I'm sure a lot of you who are in the UK saw it. So this was the work. And previously, just before, we had done this work also in Osnabrück in Germany. Which a part of this work is what is in Bern at the moment. Yeah. And finally, we are here. This is the last image. And this literally shows the studio at the moment. So this is, most of what you saw is here. So you have the parliament here. You have the studio here. I live here with my wife, so we live here. So this is the only place I live in the world when I'm not traveling. And then we have the other studio spaces. We have libraries, other things that we're building, which are all going to be here. And then we have another space here, which we're going to contain archaeological forms. We have residency space here, which we're still building, but this is currently complete, and we're accepting artists coming for residencies and other things. Already we've done about 6 residencies. And then we have artist studios, which we're building here, which is for the future, and we have the trains as living spaces, which are also here. And then we have the greenhouse here, which we're also part of the institution. We have like the pots, the airplanes and trains for classrooms and others. And then there are new buildings that we're working on. The trains that we built, the idea was the rail line, the scar, to run through the landscape. So there is, when I bought this land, it was meant for share farming. So the idea is to use it, we're growing share on the land, but we're building this local architecture which is around. So like we're building this architecture which is going to be connected to it, where we use it for experimentation of share oil and trying to like experiment with the material. And then we have land here which is meant for the building of the brick factory, where we can experiment with terracotta and other things. And then finally, we have, the idea is to expand all this that we're talking about into an art school. So the idea, and also like the glass factory and the other things that I was showing, the idea is to rebuild these things, like all these, remember I was talking about the idea of excavating the potentials out of like this, this kind of modernist era. So like going back, re-excavating these things, and then using that to build new spaces that can somehow maybe inspire a new generation of artists, and not just artists, but I think it's a question of culture, I think, whether you're a doctor or engineer or whatever. And the question is that, can we have enough people within a generation who are sensitive to the world culturally and everything? So it's not just a matter of having artists. Sometimes I think there are too many artists, and what we need is lesser artists and more sensitive artists, yes. So I think I'll end it there. Yeah.
So Ibrahim,
Yeah.
I've got no idea where to start from there. There's so much. I do know where I'm going to start, actually. There's so many things that we can cover, and I definitely want to open it up to the audience. I'm sure there's plenty of questions. We've got plenty of time. But I guess I wanted to start with, you've got pedagogical archaeology here, so which is a very good place to start in pedagogy, given that we're in an art school and you're developing an art school.
Yeah.
But I wanted to, so there's two parts to the question. The first part is to go back to Professor Karikacha Saidu, and who I think has obviously been very important for you. And so he co-founded a program in 2003, the Emancipatory Art Teaching Project, in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Kwame Nkrumah Institute, University of Science and Technology. And his project kind of revolutionized what was quite a traditional curriculum in some respects at the school by encouraging exhibitions in public spaces and getting students out from the studio and bringing art out of the studio into life of the communities, into the fabric of the city. And it was in that context that maybe just you can maybe start with that, to talk about how that influenced you to kind of go on the journey that you've gone to now. What was you mentioned about going into markets and other places to start excavating these forms, even at that point. Yeah. So maybe talk a bit about, I would love to meet Professor Karikacha, by the way, at some point. I want to definitely meet Mr. Talk a bit about that in terms of how that pedagogy influenced your practice.
Yeah. No, I think it was important quite in the beginning because if you're an artist and you're just in your studio with your easel, making paintings and all that, it can be quite interesting. But then when you're out there also taking inspiration from what is there, and not trying to mimic what is there, but trying to learn the conditions around the things and how people do, the spirits that people do things with, that's also another thing altogether. Yeah. There are many different ways we can think about it. So one is that Karikacha always said that, go to town. If you, when you go in town, when you go to the markets everywhere, when you go, you can learn how people are doing things. So for instance, when you go to the market women, they have really interesting ways in which they arrange their things. And sometimes they do it better than any artist could do it, but they just do it spontaneously because it's their everyday life. And so go learn about these forms, and then that would inspire you in your own work in terms of how you can think about art. But also the other thing was that there were some students who came from, let's say, families where their parents were like welders or blacksmiths or carpenters, but they came into art school to study painting, and they wanted to be hardcore painters. And then Karikacha was like, your father is a carpenter or a blacksmith, right? You can learn so much from your father, so why not turn your gaze to that? Because we're thinking about the expansion of art in terms of the forms, the possibilities of the form. Because all of us can't be painters. We all can be making the same work. So why not look at art from very different lenses? And I think that's where this idea of going to town is. Because we didn't have we don't have these institutions. Yeah. There weren't of course there used to be some galleries before, we had the Loom, we had the Artists Alliance Gallery by Blood Glover, the Birch Gallery, and a couple of others. But mostly hotel lobbies were places where artists were showing their work. So that also limited the ambition that the artist could bring to their work. If the size of the door is this, you're not going to make a work that is much bigger. And recently I was looking at this work by this artist. What's the name? Olga Demaral. Yeah, Olga Demaral, yes. Her studio space, the rooms that she made some of these large tapestries, was like a typical London room, very tiny. Yeah, but she made these huge tapestries out of it. So certainly when you're using these artists as examples, and I think it's also one of the things that Karikacha was interested in, because the idea of citing examples beyond what we knew, because in the previous regime, someone like Christo and Jean-Claude would not be taught in the curriculum because they thought, these artists, they are not serious. What kind of art or work is this? And it's too ambitious, and who is going to buy this? Whereas Karikacha said, no, that's not the starting point. The starting point is the question of art itself, the premise of art. So for us, of course, you can see where I got it from. It's the premise of art itself. Whether it works or it doesn't work, it's irrelevant. It's the premise of art itself. What does it really do? And then when we're able to go through that, whether it works or not, whether be the case, it can go on to inspire many other things to happen. Yeah.
So taking that point about whether it works or not opens up this question of failure, right? Which I know is something that you've been interested in, and this idea of decay and excavating these forms, these modern forms, which in that period, in Ghanaian independence from 57 until say 66, when Nkrumah was deposed. I mean, I think it's hard for us now, if people that don't have that kind of knowledge of that history, to understand just how dynamic and how forward-looking and how successful Ghana was, and not only Ghana, but other aspects. I mean, the growth rates at that point were 8-10%, which at that point, an equivalent society like Singapore, you mentioned, was much lower, right? And so at that point, West Africa, Ghana in particular, was seen as a world leader. And there was all this massive potential about building this, which obviously came out of the vision of people like Nkrumah. And so in a way, you're excavating those forms, which in some respects have failed, right? But I want to maybe talk a bit more about the uses of failure. One, in that historical context, but also in your own practice, because I can't imagine that everything worked for you when you tried to buy all these buildings or move these things. There must be multiple failures that come up. So maybe just talk a bit about the historical context of failure within the context of Ghana and how you use that, and also in your own work, in your everyday practice, how do you work with that as an artist?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess, one of the things that we had to learn as part of the program was also about these histories, and also the history of architecture. Because when you come to Kumasi, a lot of the buildings that were built there were built around that period. And also the question of energy. So, for instance, in Ghana, in the, I think, 59 to 62, that's when we built the hydroelectric dam. And Nkrumah was also interested in nuclear energy at the time. So the hydroelectric dam at the time when it was built, they had to, Ghana's population, I think, back then was about 5 million. And they moved about 200,000 people for the hydroelectric dam to be built around the time. So you can imagine there are a lot of towns and villages which are under this dam, this river. And the Akosombo Dam, of course, the lake is the largest man-made lake in the world, the Volta River. And of course, all of this was to provide energy to build these industries and everything. And there's a particular company called Valco. And the time they needed the money to build, I think at the time it was about $200 million or so back in the 50s to build this dam. And the Ghana didn't have all that money, so they borrowed part of the money. And though Nkrumah was looking more towards the east, where the money came from was in America. And this company, Valco, was from America. And then when they built it, the excess power at the time was supposed to be used in powering this dam, this factory, which Tema, Elanatri has a studio in this area. So Tema was like an industrial city built. They had all the processing things there and all that. And when the coup happened and everything, of course, over the years, all these power struggles collapsed and everything, Valco, which is the company that was meant to be processing the bauxite and everything, today when they destroy buildings which are historically important, that's where the materials are taken to remelt. So it's it's part of the legacy of this idea of building this future, which somehow became swallowed itself. So it's beginning to swallow everything that was once part of the potential. Yeah. So for me, I think that's where it becomes interesting, because when we have to even do these projects, sometimes, unfortunately, you have to say that you have to pay some bribes and everything to be able to get some of these things done. One might think that, maybe I used to be one of those people that used to think that, this is quite unethical, I'm not going to do this. But then the work is not going to happen. And if the work doesn't happen, it's not going to create that room to be able to inspire other people in terms of the forms that can go into that. So some of these historical conditions, for me, are very important as just material. And also people think of failure as an endpoint, but I like to think of it as
Absolutely.
as material to work with.
And potential.
A potential. Because sometimes when something does not work, it opens up room for us to rethink about it in a completely different manner, in a completely different way. People used to say to me, oh, the silo, when we clean it, we can take it back to what it was before. And I said, no, we cannot go back to what it was before. The building is as it is now. There are bats and other things living in. The only reason why the bats live in it is because when the city, Tamale itself, was more rural, and then they cut a lot of trees. And now the bats that were living in the city or in the village, in the rural, like in the trees, they're all now living in these buildings because there's no room for them to exist within the ecosystem. Yeah. So that is part of the legacy of our trace on this space, and we have to deal with it. And when we're dealing with it in this way, it gives us a very different relationship to the way we think about art within this context.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so let's open it up. I'm going to get... As we do that, can I just remind anyone online who wants to ask questions to... I'm not sure, any come through yet? We have got a few. So I'll come back to that in a minute. But yeah, please feel free to online to add your questions to the Q&A section. And here, we're recording this, and so I need to give you the mic so that you can ask a question, even though it doesn't amplify. It actually helps the recording. So I'm sure there are some questions, so please raise your hand, and I'll come by and hand you the mic for any questions that you might want to ask. Don't be shy. It's one at the back. There you go.
What do you love about your job most?
I don't know if I have a job. A job. I don't know. It's just it's the freedom that it comes with, you know? I think when every artist is making work, the core question at it is that the work that we're making, does it allow for new freedoms to be born within this? It can be quite paradoxical, because sometimes some artists make work that actually limits the question of freedom, you know? I was talking about this idea that sometimes when we're making work, because artists always say that, work is about freedom and we want to do this and that. But then immediately it's like, but we would like to show your work in Congo. Like, no, it's very difficult. When the work goes there, it might be destroyed. Of course, we understand that it might be destroyed also, but we also have to rethink about the relation. Like when we're making art, some of all these limitations and contradictions are also embedded within it. But the question is that, are we willing to somehow go through some of these in order sometimes to be able to open up what we make globally? And for me, that's what I'm interested in. So if I'm invited to a difficult place, I get very excited about it. I'm like, yeah, it means that it's time to like really test these ideas that we are talking about.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Okay, yes. Over here, and then after that, we'll go for a question from online. Thanks.
Thanks for such a fascinating talk. You are at the cutting edge of creativity and originality in the art world, but you're also incredibly immersive in how you allow the public to experience your art. I'm actually a lawyer, and what really is flying around in my head is, what is your attitude to protecting the originality and the intellectual property of your work when you allow the public to experience your creating that work in itself? How do you do that? How do you approach that issue?
I never think about that, actually. For me, it's always been about just letting go. I'm not one of those artists that say, someone copied my idea. If they did, I'm like, I'm very happy, because I'm like, it means that the work is having an influence, I don't think about it in that way. The whole point is about making available the process of seeing something being born. I think that if we had the chance to see, I think it's one of the things about being a human being, is because of the limitation of our lifespan. We live so brief that we don't get to appreciate what life actually is, because the universe is so big, so much time has happened for us to get to this moment. But in the moment when we're doing something, we think about it in relation to a few years, in relation to 10 years, 20 years. But I also like to think that if you're going to live 20 years or 30 years on Earth, then you have to pretend that all the billions of years that afforded you this moment, you have to compress all that into a point. And it means we have to learn to disseminate and share. So I'm not really afraid of, and I never think about intellectual problem. For me, I just do. And then if people can have access to it and we can discuss and all that, yeah. It's also about legacy, I think. Yeah, so I want, in a couple of years, I want people to ask, oh, that artist, there was one crazy artist before, you know? I've met people like that in my life where you wanted to do something and then no one, like you couldn't find people like, oh, but there's one mad guy who was somewhere, and then that begins. Yeah, so it's one of those. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Anyway, are there any questions from...
Yeah.
Yes, we've had a question about your practice, and the attendee has asked, you speak about courage and using courage. Could you unpick that concept and whether you see courage as gendered?
No, no, certainly it's not. It's just the spirit that we're talking about. It's not. It's just, and the courage is not also just about us. It's the world around us in itself. It's about the material forms that we're working with, the ecosystem, all this. What's the name? When you come to when you come to, like when you're in Ghana, let me use Ghana as an example. Like in the north, when you're driving within our local community, like when you go from point A to B, from here to Victoria, sometimes by the time you get to Victoria, you would have to get out from your car a few times and then drive the goats and the sheep out of the way. Yeah. Of course, the goats know that the car can hit them and they will die. Yeah, but then again, they sleep on the road. It might be practical, maybe to absorb the heat or whatever, like to pick something on the road to eat and all that. But I think courage comes in many different forms. It's the same as, for instance, the objects that we try to save, in terms of like there are some materials that are within certain spaces which sometimes you think that it's almost impossible to get them in the form that they are in. But for some reason, the ecosystem that develops around those spaces allows for a certain kind of natural preservation and everything. So when I think about courage, I just don't think about it in relation to the artist or form, but in a certain kind of totality. Yeah. So certainly, even if you're thinking about it in relation to gender, I think in the studio we work with far many women than even men within the studio in Ghana. And particularly up north, most of the people who do most of the most interesting and difficult things, the weaving and everything, they're all done by women. So I'm also very much interested in what that means for a generation that is coming up. There is an image I didn't show, because one of the most interesting thing about the work that we do, the question of the dissemination, is about how people come to the studio. So a lot of the images that you see, the kids might be coming there by themselves, but also we rent buses and we go to these rural communities and we bring the kids. But we just don't bring the kids alone. We bring them with their parents, and mostly we bring them with their mothers. Yeah, because when their mothers understand where they're going, because people can be very skeptical. Oh, why are you going this place? You say it's a strange guy who doesn't know what to do with his money, and they build this strange studio, and then blah, blah, blah. There are weird objects, there are trains, like it doesn't belong here, like things like that. But suddenly when they're there, and even when they're coming, the way they dress, like I was looking at the Met Gala the other day, and sometimes some of these women who come there, like the way they dress, are unbelievable. Like no fashion designer can match, yeah. And it's like that when they're coming there, like with their motorbikes and their shades and everything, like taking their kids, like their 4 kids on the bike, and then, yeah. That for me, again, about when I was showing that image with the kids in the tricycle, that courage. And lastly, also, there are 2 couples here. The question of courage is also, it's very important in relation to this gender. So we have this Simon and the wife here. Maybe you wave a bit. So Simon and the wife, they were doing this driving expedition, and they drove from the UK all the way through West Africa to Ghana over a 3-year period. Yeah, and then they ended up in Tamale. They came to the studio, and then we had a conversation. We're looking at the trains and everything. And then when they were leaving Ghana after everything, we were talking about art, because Simon is an artist himself. And then he made paintings along the way and all that. And we're talking about all of that. And then he gifted the car to the studio. Of course, not to drive around, but to think about the memory of this carriage. Because, look, to drive through this area, West Africa, it's not very easy. And to park the car somewhere for 2 years, come back to race, things like that. So the question of courage, it goes across board. Whether being it from, and also for the wife to trust, like to drive alone, like on these roads. Yeah, it takes quite a lot. So for me, when I'm thinking about it in relation to what we do, in relation to what the ecosystem has to present, what people who are coming from elsewhere, because again, I always talk about the fact that at home, I can't even get my local, assemblyman or MP to visit the studio with all of this that we're talking about. But then you can get someone like Simon and the wife driving all the way from the UK and ended up in a place like this. So it's not really specific to something. It's a point that we can all contribute and harness from. It's a universal thing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the room?
One last question.
Okay. Maybe two.
Okay, two. Yes.
Ibrahim, I could listen to you all evening. As you know, I've watched your work for many years. As an Afro-Arab, I'm listening to your story afresh today with so much pride. I'm looking at your timelines and the dates of you spent a lot of time in Makkah, Jeddah, Sharjah. I'm interested in how the Arabs perceive your work, given that you are telling an African story, and these are Africans, and you, of course, being a beautiful cultural ambassador for the work that you do. How does that sit with the curators and the investors in the Middle East, given that their relationship with labor and even the sacks that you use and their economical relationship with Africa and the logistics? What do curators do with you when you're in Sharjah? How is that from your point of view? Because as an Afro-Arab, it's frustrating for me, and I'm extra proud of you this evening listening to how hands-on you are, and just wondering how you navigate that space, knowing that this looks very different from the other side of the Red Sea.
Yeah.
That's a very good question.
Yeah. I've done quite a bit of work I did some work in Sharjah as part of the biennial. Sometimes you're very lucky, it's the people you work with. So for instance, if you're working with Hor, it's easier because she understands, she knows what she's doing, coming from both practical, intellectual point of view, beyond maybe her family and everything, but just as a person in terms of what she brings to the art and the discourse around it. I remember when I did this, I was invited to Saudi to the Alula project, and I worked with two curators, Marcelo Dantos and Maya. And the idea was to think about ways we could bring in objects or working with things that could resonate with the idea of the desert. So I took these pots, historical pots from Ghana, and then we made this installation and all that. Yeah, for me, it's very important because then when we're bringing these objects to these spaces, we're bringing the stories. And then also for me, it was very important to be able to propose these kinds of ambitious works within those spaces, because also coming from Ghana, I posted this video on online the other day where I was talking about the fact that I'm a Muslim and I pray 5 times a day, and then my family was not impressed, like, no, that's not true. But but then I'm a Muslim, so I try to keep up as much as I can with the faith of it. And my entire family, on my mother's side, 10 generations ago, there were Arab scholars who came to Niger to spread Islam, and then Nigeria. So my mother's father came from Nigeria to Ghana. There were Islamic scholars who ended up in Ghana. And so my entire family, even my father's side, our relationship to Saudi and that area has always been in relation to Makkah and Islam and everything. But I always said, we can look at it in relation to other forms. We can look at it in relation to, let's say, the question of labor and everything. Because when you go to this area, and we also know because it's fast developing since oil and everything was found, there's a lot of architecture, many things that are born. And of course, in the last 2 decades, there have been many articles on like labor force, people dying, like especially from like Bangladesh, India, those places. So again, when I'm making work as an artist, knowing where I'm coming from, I'm also reflecting on that very much. And I think if you work, when I work with people, I insist, because the form of the work through the labor conditions and everything is very, very important. And we try as much as possible to be able to disseminate that within that context. Yeah.
Great.
Elias.
Okay, final question. Maria?
Thank you. A really fascinating talk. And I just had a question about how you work with others. A very simple question. So the work seems, and I'm sorry, I didn't know very much about your work before, so maybe it comes from that place of kind of not having the context. Yeah. But the work seems really collaborative. The work seems to be at scale. And to include communities, particularly your local community. And so I was really interested to understand how you navigate the ethics of working with different types of people in that context, and the dynamics there, the power dynamics, the social dynamics of that practice. So just interesting to hear more.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. That's a very valid question, a very important one. Sometimes I'm also just very practical when I'm producing things, So for instance, when we're doing the work for the Barbican, and also there's this other project which I'm doing in the Middle East at the moment, which we're thinking about the production. And they're like, oh yeah, maybe we can produce it here, because the idea also produce this material that looks industrial. But I said, no, it looks industrial, but the idea is to go back to the question of the hand. So we had to set up, I had to work with a couple of friends who, like, there's a fashion designer in Tamale called Fatu. And then the husband, they helped me together with my uncle and my studio assistant to set up these, to work with the local, there are a lot of local masters who are like young girls are apprentices doing this apprenticeship thing with them. So the idea was to find ways in which we could disseminate the work through that system. So for instance, sometimes we give the work to them, and then sometimes a lot of the work that we do, I can't really control the form that it takes at the end of the day, because it's a question of the production system. Yeah, because sometimes when you're sewing, because you might sew something and you realize, they sew something and realize that, oh, this area could be done, but I just leave it in that way. Because sometimes they also leave in, it's also about the contribution of the hand in relation to this. And I think there's a sense of critique also within the making of the work itself in relation, because this area where some of these things that I'm doing, historically, that was where a lot of things were being produced, like cotton, all this thing. But today, none of that exists. Everything has to come from China. So for instance, in the question of this material, all of this historically would have been made in the same place. But today, though, like, the garments are being worn, this other one, of course, had the garments on it. The garments are being made. Oh, it's known for, like, the locals make it, and it's known as a dagomba. But the fabric, the thread, down to the thread, it's made in China. So in making the work, some of these questions are, for me, within it. We might not discuss or talk about it, but for me, certainly, if I have a budget to produce a work, then I'm thinking, how do we disseminate and distribute the budget in such a way that if you have 50,000 euros to produce a work like this, then you're asking yourself, if I'm going to work with 10,000 people, how do we stretch that budget in order to be able to produce the work? So if we're working with 1,000 people over a month, how do we distribute that in order to be able to make sure that... And also some of them, like, it also keeps... One thing that sometimes, because there was a question that came up before about the idea of... there was one time where someone said, oh, but the artist studio within the context of the city is meaningless because it doesn't really produce anything. But then it produces a lot, because aside when you're spending money on producing systems and things, it only doesn't just allow for people to be paid for things, but it also keeps certain traditions going. Because for a lot of these practices, to also expand that reach, because sometimes when we are sewing and trying out certain technique, like, but we've never done it this way before. Like, yeah, but let's try and push it in a different way. By the time you realize, they incorporate it into the fashion because they tried something different was tried. And I think that's what art can do. Of course, there will always be bits of loopholes here and there and things like that, but certainly that is part of things like that emerge out of when you're working with large groups of people. There are always problems that are bound to come out from these things, but certainly the most important thing is to start from knowing that you're trying to be as straightforward and as ethical as possible as you can be in order to be able to do these things. Yeah. And the one last thing, I remember one time some of these were like paying like people that would pay them, some of the people that were working, but I realized that it wasn't really working that way. So you have to pay people individually. So sometimes you're working, and at the end of the day, it takes more time to pay people than even to produce the work itself, because you're trying to make sure that every single person gets the money right in their own hands, rather than relying on like this system, this apprenticeship system. So it's all part of the thing. But good thing, I have a huge group of, I have a very good team of people I work with at home, so they make the work as easy as it can be.
Okay, so I think we're going to close there. It just remains with me to extend a huge thank you to you, Ibrahim. I know your schedule is crazy. I can't remember where you're going to next. Is it Indonesia or somewhere? Where are you going next? Somewhere.
Paris. Just around the corner, yes.
Paris, and then, yeah. So thank you for sharing your time, your labor, your ideas. I'm really happy that you want to continue this dialogue with us at Chelsea, Campbell, Wimbledon, and TrAIN. And this is something which we hope will be a regular platform. And to develop something, and particularly around these ideas of pedagogy, something that we can, there's so much we can learn, I know, here from what you're doing there, and in other places in Ghana as well. So this is a relationship that I'm really keen for us to develop and keep that going, and see what we can develop. So thank you, Ibrahim, for that. And also thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.